Welcome to today's webinar. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce and have on the panel two of the superstars in the world of strategy, or the world of strategic management, Harvey Singh and Rivkin. So before we get started, let me give you a little bit of a sense of how we're going to conduct this panel and this session. Let me first read what the distinguished awards that these awardees have received. And so Harvey Singh, as Andrea just mentioned, has been awarded the C.K. Prana Distinguished Scholar Practitioner Award, introduced in 2011, which was created to honor the legacy of C.K. Prahlad. The award recognizes excellence in the application of theory and research in practice. These include, but are not limited to, contributions to knowledge through the extraction of learning from practice, authored scholarly works that have substantially affected the practice of management and/or the integration of research and practice. So congratulations, Harbir. We are so delighted to have you here. Rivkin, who's the awardee for the SMS Educational Impact Award, which recognizes excellence in contributing to the teaching mission in strategic management. It will be given annually to an individual who has made an exemplary contribution to quality and innovation in the teaching of strategic management, either through their own teaching and mentoring activities and/or by empowering other teachers with innovations and high-quality teaching materials. So congratulations, Jan.
Thank you, X.
So what we're going to do in this webinar is I'm going to first ask each of the awardees, Harbir and Jan, to give us a little thumbnail sketch of their personal journeys. So how do they, how do we, why are we awarding them for the wonderful work they've done, and how do they become superstars, which of course they are in the field. I will then ask each of them a set of questions. So these are questions which, full disclosure, we've discussed in advance. So these are somewhat prepared, but I'm also going to ask some follow-on questions which may be, less prepared. And I'm also going to ask the other panelists to jump in, the other awardee to jump in, because of course, both Harbir and Jan are past masters at both teaching and research and practitioner outreach. At the end of that process, I'm going to open it up to a series of questions from the audience, you folks. So as Andrea mentioned, please be sure to write those questions into the Q&A box, and I will pick some questions and try and get to as many questions as we can. So please be sure to write all the questions that you can possibly think of. We will end with little closing remarks from each of Harbir, each of the awardees, Harbir and Jan, and then we'll wrap it up. We go until 10:15. So let me begin by introducing my dear friend, Harvey Singh, who I have known for, what is it now, 30 years?
Yes, long time.
Harvey Singh is the William and Phyllis Mack Professor and co-director of the Mack Center for Technological Innovation at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. He also directs the Huntsman Program at Wharton, which is a dual degree program in the arts and sciences and in business. Harvey's research centers on managing alliances and acquisitions, corporate governance, and business development, with the relational view and work on the dedicated alliance function being some of the most influential works in the field of strategy. His work, of course, has been published in our top journals, but also in practitioner journals like the Harvard Business Review and the Sloan Management Review. His book, Strategic Leaders Roadmap, which integrates strategy and leadership principles, has greatly inspired executives, as have his books, Fortune Makers, the leaders creating China's great global companies, and The India Way. And all of these Harbir has done, as I am aware of, by interviewing CEOs in each of these countries and distilling what they've talked about and what it means for our understanding of how strategy works in each of those countries. So they're really fascinating books, and obviously are a big reason why he's the justifiable awardee today. One of his articles, How to Make Strategic Alliances Work, has served as a template for implementation and has guided executives in many companies. And his other work, one of his other pieces on alliances versus acquisitions and how companies make that choice, is a very well used article in many strategic alliances and acquisitions courses. And I have had the privilege of using that for a number of years as well. So let me now move to Jan. And Jan is the C. Roland Christensen Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School, where he also chairs the MBA program. His research, course development, and teaching focus on two topics: business strategy and, more recently, US competitiveness. Jan's business strategy work examines how managers do and should make cross-cutting decisions, which, by the way, is a theme which goes through not only his basic work in strategy, but also his work on US competitiveness, as we shall see. Cross-cutting decisions, that is, choices with ramifications that span functional and product boundaries in companies. His work on US competitiveness focuses especially on local cross-sector collaborations. And Jan, I had the privilege of reading those cases that you've written on cross-sector collaborations, which are really quite inspiring. The one in Columbus, Ohio, for example, and the one in Southwire as well. And his work in the cases, some of the cases which I just mentioned, are about how civic leaders in governments, business, nonprofits, and other parts of society come together to create shared prosperity. So again, it is my privilege and great delight to have Harbir and Jan on the panel. And again, I want to start off by reinforcing my congratulations for this very richly deserved awards. Okay, so let's get into the Q&A, and Q&A meaning that Q&A which I'll be doing. But before that, I wanted to ask Jan to give us a set of personal remarks, a little bit of a philosophy of how you got to this point. So what inspired you? What drove you? As we well know, your contributions to case writing are quite incredible. You've got over 25 cases, which are very widely used by, I've used them for, decades, I think. And what is it that made you tick?
Sure. Thanks, Ax. And thank you for the generous intro and for hosting the webinar today. It's such a humbling honor to be recognized by the Strategic Management Society, especially because the SMS is kind of my professional family. It's also an honor to share the webinar with Harbir, whose work I've admired and learned from since I was with doctoral students. So Harbir, congratulations. Yeah, just as you say, X, I think the recognition, which is more than I deserve, it reflects my case writing and the widespread adoption of cases over the years. And I say what more than I deserve, and I really mean it. The widespread adoption, it owes more to the institution I'm privileged to serve, Harvard Business School, than to me personally, because HBS has kind of given me a few things that have been key ingredients to the widespread adoption. Amazing mentors who taught me to write cases, incredible colleagues who have taught the early versions and helped improve the cases, and then a publishing platform. But you asked kind of the personal journey and what's made me so passionate about writing, teaching cases, and teaching notes, and so forth. And maybe the way I'll answer that is just by trying to make the case for writing cases and teaching notes. And in fact, I'll make a strong version. I'm going to try to persuade all the folks on the call today, and especially the junior faculty members, to go out and try your hand at writing cases if you've not. And I think as I make the case for it, you'll see why I've gotten so passionate about this over time. So one way to make the case for cases is to argue they're great teaching vehicles. And I think that's the case. Others might argue otherwise. But frankly, if you think cases are great teaching vehicles, there's no reason for you to individually go out and write them. All right, you can just order them from a bunch of great institutions. What I want to argue is that cases are not only great teaching vehicles, but writing cases is also a great research vehicle and a great faculty development vehicle. And here's what I mean. I find that case writing gets faculty members like us, and certainly me, out in the field, interacting with managers, figuring out what the biggest problems they face are, what the biggest challenges they are, the questions they wish they had answers to, right? And in turn, that gives us faculty like an unfair advantage in figuring out what are the questions that have practical relevance. If you feel, as I do, and I think Harbir will make the same case, that faculty members should be writing research on things that matter, then by writing cases and teaching material, you actually have a bridge between practice on one side and research on the other. So what really makes me passionate about this, what has led me to be so engaged in case writing and teaching note writing, has been that bridge. And I'll just give you one concrete example. So one of my first papers was on the imitation of complex strategies. The basic argument was that if you had a bunch of small decisions that were related to one another, it could be a buried imitation. And my talk for that paper featured as one example, Southwest Airlines, a company whose individual choices seemed pretty easy to copy, and yet it was defying imitation. So I'm giving that talk, and when Barry Nailbuff, our colleague at Yale, is in the audience, and he raises his hand and he says, "What about Ryanair in Europe? Haven't they copied Southwest successfully?" I knew nothing about Ryanair, but I figured there was something important to learn. So I wrote to the CEO and said, "Can I come write a case?" Because I figured he'd let me write a case. And sure enough, he invited me over. I went over to start to learn. One thing I learned was actually their strategy is not quite a replica of Southwest. There are important differences. But what was more fascinating was hearing the managers talk about how they got to their strategy, and particularly hearing the disagreements from interviewing people for the case. So they had an old strategy before their no-frills strategy that wound up failing, and they had to pivot. And I asked, how did you pivot to the no-frills strategy? And I asked people from the top to the bottom of the organization. At the top, they talked a lot about vision. They had the vision of what Southwest had done. They decided to try to do it in Europe. At the bottom, they gave a very different answer. They didn't talk about vision. They said we had no cash. We had no cash, so we had no choice. We had to strip out every amenity, and so we had to drop our prices. People showed up. We were kind of surprised. But it became very clear there was an interesting, fascinating research question here about where new strategies really come from. A question I would never have gotten to if I had not had this experience of going out and writing cases. And it fueled a series of efforts. So case writing can lead you to great relevant questions. They can also be a great research vehicle in a second way. They can provide data. As you get to know managers and earn their trust through a case writing process, they start to open their doors and give you data. I wrote a series of cases at the FBI after 9/11, and after the case series, they started to share non-classified data, which has fueled research. I'd also say that there's a faculty development aspect in addition to a research aspect of writing cases. And for me particularly, going out and writing cases and spending time talking about the deepest dilemmas that managers face, the big challenges they have, it's just giving me more appreciation for what a difficult job general managers have. And I think that has made me a more empathetic and I hope more effective teacher for my students. The final case I'll make for cases and for writing cases, it's simply fun. It's taken me to the floor of the Lego factory in Denmark, to the firing range at the training facility of the FBI, and a lot of other places that I would never have gotten to otherwise. So I hope that makes a pitch for why this activity of writing cases has been a passion of mine. And I hope I can persuade some folks out there who haven't done it yet to give it a try.
Okay, thanks, Jan. That was really inspiring. Learned a lot. Let me move on to Harbir and ask you a similar question. So what made you arrive at this point in your personal research journey, and what makes you tick?
Thanks, Ax, and thanks, Jan, for such an inspiring case. I've actually done some casework myself, and I completely agree with you. But you're the quintessential developer of great cases. I want to start by just thanking the jury that awarded this award of C.K. Prahlad to me, which was a very pleasant surprise. I want to talk a little bit about C.K., whom I happened to know as a PhD student and also throughout my career. And so in the spirit of the personal journey, Ax, I came from the statistics area in the PhD program into strategy because I loved the questions. And CK was instrumental in that transfer between fields, saying strategy has so many big questions, and you can think about inference there, which was a wonderful introduction to what turned out to be a great journey. In my summer in the first year, he invited me to work with him on a project with a company that was intending to make solar collectors, and it was about solar energy and whether you can make money in solar energy making collectors. So I spent 2 months in the summer researching the solar energy industry, the technical features of, I'm an electrical engineer, so could understand some of the technical features on solar collectors, but also photovoltaic cells. There were also other technologies at the time, wind energy and so on. And I created a technical report, and CK and I went to the sponsoring organization. And when we presented the report, he kind of started by saying, how do you make money as a solar collector manufacturer? And what he essentially did was, this is Porter's value chain book. He wrote a value chain down and said that the hardware of solar collectors is not going to make as much money as the complementary systems. And that was somewhere in my report, but it was not the conceptual clarity with which he spoke about it. And for me, I think that was a very transformational experience, because till today, I've been working on, one of the themes is on emerging technologies and emerging industries. So to reinforce Jan's point, fieldwork can get you to places you never expected. And I owe it to CK for this. I also want to thank my co-authors and students and advisors, because this journey was very much a collective journey, and have learned a lot from many people. The way I think about the core ideas, the relational view, how did the relational view come about? It was partly through conversations with Jeff Dyer, who had done a lot of work on the Toyota production system, but looking at it in terms of not transaction costs so much, but what beyond governance can generate value. And I think that when we were talking, we talked a lot about asset specificity and the strategic elements of asset specificity. But also I had been exposed to the field in India on 2 very interesting joint ventures, one that was successful and one that was a failure, even though it could be successful. There was a joint venture between P&G and an Indian company called Godrej, which had all the hallmarks of challenging Unilever. But what happened there was essentially lack of trust and major governance problems and contractual problems. And Mr. Godrej, who's a very insightful businessman, just shut down the deal, even though there was a lot of value. So I was kind of asking the question, this is really a gap in thinking about how to partner in alliances. So, and I thought about alliances really being a different way of thinking about competition. It is a relational mindset. And that became the underlying sort of framework where we talked about asset specificity, complementarity, and knowledge sharing routines, which Jeff Dyer brought from Toyota, and then informal and formal governance. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, in the spirit of what Jan is saying, we think about phenomena, theory, and empirics. And a lot of us are trained in empirics and inference, but we really have to understand how phenomena drive our understanding of theory and the foundations of our empirical work. And at least for me, that has been a major animator of my interest in strategy. The last point I'll make, one more quick story. I worked in a company in India that was a multinational, that was actually a product of a merger between a Scottish firm and an Indian business group, really. And we were in the throes of post-merger integration, and I was a fresh MBA working in the management team, and I could see firsthand how governance and cultural differences were filtering into our actual strategic decision making, even at the lower level in the organization. So when it came time to do a thesis choice, I really thought I could not really do integration because it required a lot of field work, and the field was not ready for that. But it really helped me think about integrating the financial view and the strategic view of M&A. And what emerged was, do synergies get priced appropriately post-merger? And that was the foundation of my thesis. And even when I was doing the thesis, I didn't realize that my prior experience with the phenomena drove my inquiry. So I'll end by saying that for me, I'll make a different kind of call, additional call to what Jan is saying. We really need to look at phenomena throughout our work when we're doing empirics or theory building, because strategy is an applied system, and many new ideas can emerge, new perspectives. The relational view emerged because the dominant view was the transaction cost view, and we felt we had to bring in asset specificity and specialized assets. And really it became a connection with the resource-based view at the same time. So I'll stop there, but I want to, again, it's been a wonderful, wonderful journey. Many more things to come.
Okay, that's terrific, Harbir. Very, very insightful, great learning. So let me transition now to asking you a set of questions. And I'm going to ask Jan to jump in, particularly on the question, which is, of course, the overriding question that we are all wrestling with, which is, how does strategy change? How do we think about strategy differently in a world which is experiencing discontinuous change, like the COVID crisis? So Harbir, back to you. What did you do, beyond your initial thinking of getting into the relational view? How did you kind of continue that? I know you've got this fantastically cited article with Jeff on the relational view, but how did you progress that? And, how did you advance that agenda beyond this, great realization which you had early on that, the relational view and trust matter?
Right, which of course, actually you've done some very, very influential work on trust in organizations and across organizations. I think, so the idea of what is capability really was very much a central question at Wharton in the management department, and Sid Winter and Dan Leventhal, many others were working on it. CK had worked on core competence. And I thought that the progression would be, what is acquisition capability and what is alliance capability? And so Prashant Kale and I did a lot of field work on alliance capability, trying to understand what could be the underlying concepts. And you could see successful firms like HP at the time, a world-class partnering organization, which we got access to, But you could also see Philips as an organization that left a lot of money on the table, even though they had great core technologies. And so the contrast between the two, and linking it to the evolutionary view of the firm that Sid Winter was working on, kind of naturally led to the idea that capabilities probably reside in tacit and codified knowledge. So how do we think about tacit knowledge in the context of alliances? And how do we think about codified knowledge in the context of alliances? And that led to a multi-industry, large sample, field-based survey piece of work, where we actually found strong evidence that the presence of an alliance function and knowledge sharing routines actually differentiates success factors in alliances by as much as 18%. In other words, if the baseline rate is 45%, then if you have these additional complementary processes, it could be as much as 63%.
Wow, yeah, that's terrific. So while on that subject, you've done some work on, sorry to get technical, but we are with colleagues.
Yes.
Into variance decomposition.
Yes.
And can you tell us something about that?
So Dick Rumelt, who is of course a major influential figure in the field, had done the defining work on related diversification. And then I think about in the early 90s, early to mid 90s, he came up with a variance decomposition analysis that followed Schmollensee, which essentially concluded that the corporate effect, if you decompose variance on what drives returns in diversified firms, the industry effect, the business unit effect, and the corporate effect was near zero. And it was really mostly business unit effect. Industry effect was also low. And many people began getting involved. Anita McGann and Mike Porter wrote a very nice paper around that subject. And they concluded that the industry effect was stronger. Sejin Chang and I kind of were thinking about variance decomposition in a different way, wondering whether this was a data specific, because they had the FTC data. So we took line of business data and sort of defined industry broadly and narrowly, and then did an analysis of corporate effects in the context of a 4-digit versus a 2-digit representation of industry. And also we used a different dependent variable, which was market position at the line of business, rather than accounting returns, which would be subject to allocation principles. And we actually found that the corporate effect was greater when the industry was defined more narrowly. So it could be an artifact of the original data. And so this, I think, that's the great thing about strategy, that we are also empirically, the field is very sophisticated.
Right, okay, terrific. So as we continue to think about linking empirics and theory to practice, how do you, think about internal and external validity in your research designs, and how does that play a role in making that connection, that bridge to practice?
Right. I think, the field has advanced greatly, and I particularly like the work that tries to establish causality using, quasi-experimental designs and many adjustments for identification and also for selection issues. I think the other part that I hope we will be doing is more on really understanding whether we represent the phenomenon and whether the experimental design does not assume away the problem. And I think those are the two additional things I want to think about. And I've been speaking of COVID, I've been quite fascinated with the epidemiology debate, which is now in the public domain, about which trial is good and which trial is bad, and or not as good. And you see very much a phenomena-based approach with very sophisticated empirics, and the stakes are very high. And certainly the stakes in strategy are high. We're talking about success and failure of big corporations. And so I think when we go to experimental designs, high internal validity, my thought would be that we think carefully about how to design the experiment so that we don't assume away the problem. Similarly, on external validity, you briefly talked about my work on strategic leadership, and that was a great revelation to me. And as Jan was saying, for me, the revelation was field-based work, interviewing 100 CEOs in India over a course of 4 years with 3 co-authors. Mike Useem is a master at this, Peter Capelli, Jitendra Singh. and then 75 CEOs in China and many in the US for a different project, I felt that we sometimes underuse, inductive work that might help us define new problems. And I know that's neither internal nor external validity, but I'm making a case for inductive research that might get us into new territories.
Well, that's so interesting. While on that subject, where you mentioned that the insights that you got from the CEOs from China and the CEOs from India were really quite different in very fundamental ways.
Yes.
And you might imagine that the problems of business are more generalized. So we're all trying to kind of create competitive advantage in a sustainable way,
right?
Given that market. So there should be some differences in the market which might make a difference to how one thinks about strategy, how one thinks about implementing strategy.
Right.
But you uncovered some really much more deep differences in the way the CEOs from these two countries saw strategy.
Yes.
So what were those, and why do you think they were there?
Very, very. It's a wonderful question, and there's all this work on global convergence, right? And when we teach cases or theory and strategy, we are presuming convergence. The shareholder, the primacy of the shareholder. Now we have the stakeholder view, and so on. And the good news for strategy scholars is that both in India and in China, CEOs, when you talked about priority of how you spend your time, in both instances, being the initiator of strategy and the keeper of the organizational culture were high in both cases. These are high growth economies. In the US, of course, you might find it different. But the difference in India was much more a focus on improvisation and flexibility in an environment that has a lot of regulatory volatility as well, in addition to other volatility, but also a deep commitment to talent. And that was because corporations really were also an avenue for development. And so the CEOs saw the need to provide a good opportunity for their workers. In China, I think what was fascinating was sort of the agility with which they could pursue scale. Normally scale and agility are not correlated, but because they were very aligned organizations, almost reflecting the external society, and because there's not a whole lot of strategic debate in the middle and lower levels, they were able to execute at a high velocity. It was breathtaking velocity to see how fast they had grown. And I think we forget that sometimes, that communities of employees have certain characteristics that reflect the underlying values of the society they're in. And also, again, the question of lack of debate in these organizations was interesting, which today I think we see some consequences of that. But I give my co-authors, Vita Capelli, Mike Usim, and Nang Liang, and Jitendra Singh a lot of credit, because the other thing when you do field work is inferring from lots of notes. And we did a lot of sort of convergence of our findings as we read the interviews, and there was convergence, but it was I learned a lot from my co-authors, and I think it gave me a window into application.
Okay, thank you. So let's segue now into asking a question which is directly related to the times we live in, and I'm going to ask Jan to come in as well.
Right.
But Harbir, what are the new opportunities in strategy,
right,
in strategic management, both from a theory, an empirics, and a practice perspective, that the pandemic has generated and presents to us, and how can we make a contribution as strategy scholars?
Well, I think it's a great question. So the first one, of course, is about COVID being a discontinuity no one could have possibly anticipated in scale. So I think the shock to the system and how firms react, I think, is a great opportunity to think about that as a sort of studying agility and adaptability of organizations is one opportunity. I think, and I'll be brief because I know Jan has much to say on this. The second one really is a race for the vaccine. I think that is a fundamental, and it's very public, and thinking about the extended enterprise, which is really what, in a sense, the ecosystem world is also about, and understanding the productivity of different extended enterprises in the race for the vaccine, where there's a very clear performance measure, I think is a very interesting research question. And the third one is sort of the explore and exploit duality that we talk about, that now because exploit has been so badly shocked, it may be a good way to think about better and worse ways to explore. We may see some very divergent outcomes in firms that have sort of effective exploration mechanisms and firms that don't. So I think there are lots of, and those are just few of the questions that I think.
That's fascinating.
Can I jump in on this one, Ax, as well? Because I think, first of all, just to second what Harbir said, this is like, I mean, as terrible as the pandemic is, it is like the biggest natural experiment one could imagine, right? So I think a lot of cool research with, you know, interesting identification strategies will come out of it. I'd actually kind of go back first to the heuristic composition work that Harbir was saying. We're going to see huge variance in how well companies come through the pandemic. And I'd love to know how much is industry. So look, if you are in the restaurant business, you're kind of in trouble. If you are in the business of bringing large crowds together in venues, you're in trouble. If you're in the disinfectant business, you're probably in a much better place. That, I think on top of that, we're going to see massive variation within industry, right? And figuring out why some companies within a given, why some restaurants are going to thrive. And I'm particularly interested, this goes back to Harbir's work and capabilities, like what role the pre-existing capabilities are going to play. Are they going to be something that hold back companies or something that actually push them forward? When I think like at HBS, just the organization I know best, our prior online instruction experience has been pivotal in being able to make the pivot that we've made. So I'd love to see kind of what did pre-existing capabilities do? Because, you know, org structures could hold people back. So I started kind of variance to the composition.
Yeah, no, terrific. And you know, goes back to what Harbir was saying as well about agility. Yeah. So the organizations of firms that are more able to apply those capabilities more quickly, deploy them, pivot them, be agile and be more responsive are, you know, clearly going to have an edge in responding to today's environment. Okay,
absolutely.
So Jan, a few more specific questions to you.
Great.
So let me start by asking you about case studies and the role of case studies in teaching strategy. Isn't that outmoded? Because as we well know, you know, by the time you finish writing the case, you finish writing the teaching notes, so much has changed, and you know, students are always looking for, you know, the latest, greatest, shiniest object out there, and they see anything, you know, particularly in a world that's changing faster and faster, anything that's you know, that's also 21st, you know, century, or the first decade of the 21st century.
Yeah, no, I find myself relying much less on the old classic static cases, right? For sure. But I still think the case studies work. But what I find is increasingly we've got to use case series in order to prepare students to do well in a volatile world. Because we do have this incredible volatility. So a case where you get all the facts and then you have to decide what to do from now to forever is just not realistic. But a case where here are the facts, what are you going to do? Great, here's what you did, here's what happens next. Now what do you do? And so forth. So just as a concrete instance, last year I happened to write a case on Hurtigruten, which is the Norwegian company that's the world's leading provider of expedition cruises to the polar regions. So if you want to go to Antarctica, you probably want to go with them. This year when we teach, and then the motivating question, should they go beyond the polar regions into warmer waters? This year we'll engage that question, but then we'll also say, hey, wait, while you're making that decision, COVID-19 strikes, and that profoundly affects the cruise industry, obviously. What do you do now? How does that affect your future decisions? So, yeah, I just love the kind of real-time case updates. You can use cases in a volatile world. You've got to use them differently.
Right. And can you say a little bit about how the shift to remote teaching is going at HBS? You're the head of the MBA program, you're the associate dean of MBAs, or kind of dean of MBAs. And what are the challenges there, and how can you relate the things we've been talking about, and you touched upon it a little bit about how you were able to quickly pivot at HBS. So, what are you doing? What's working? What's not working? And how did your capabilities allow you to pivot to delivering remote instruction?
Yeah. So, first of all, I'd love to learn from your experience and from Harbir's experience here. Everyone on this call is experiencing this, and we're all going to need to learn from each other. I'd say it's going pretty well so far. I cross my fingers and toes and rub the rabbit's foot and throw salt over my shoulders as I say that. But at least in terms of delivering the educational content. The social curriculum, if you will, I'm not so satisfied with. I wish we had better ways of bringing our students together, even though we're on campus. Our approach has been a little different. We haven't done the go all remote or go all in person. Instead, we've got this range of modes that go all the way from remote to fully in person. We kind of move the dimmer switch depending on how the virus is behaving in the community. But we got through the first 75 days before we had to do anything about moving the dimmer switch down. The main thing I've noticed, tremendous innovation. I just got a list of my colleagues' responses to how they've innovated. It's really impressive. For our top lessons, I'd say we've learned the content can be delivered remotely. It can't be done well simply by taking what we were doing before and translating it directly. We can only deliver about 70% as much content per class session. We need new ways to keep students engaged. Breakout rooms, polls, small group discussion. I see the chat has been coming up with simulations as one way. We found it really worthwhile to invest in adequate technology for students and faculty. And we've invested a lot in having staff members who help out with the technology so that the faculty can focus on what they do. So this is kind of how, so far, cautiously optimistic. Same time, for many, many reasons in the world, we need a vaccine soon, and I think we need it for our instruction as well. Harbir, how's it going for you? What would you say have been the big takeaways? I don't mind if I ask one of the questions too.
Of course, yeah. I think, Jan, I know Harvard has done an amazing job, and you've been in the center of it. So congratulations for dealing with it so well.
It's a journey.
Yes, but still, it's remarkable. I think the thing I would add, I think that I agree with the 70%. That's roughly what my experience is. One thing I began to add was having, besides the case, I do 3-hour sessions in my case because of our executive. So I actually added, as when I could, a live interview with an executive, and it's easier these days because they don't have to travel. And I called it a live case study, and I linked it to the topic. So if it's on managing alliances, and that was very useful.
Yeah. No, we're in this weird world where everyone is as close or as far as my next door neighbor.
Yes.
So we've also taken big advantage of that.
Yes.
Okay, before we transition to Q&A from the audience, and I know questions are coming in, Jan, I'd just like to ask you one last thing, which, I've been teaching strategy for 30 years, which is a question that I ask myself and the students also ask, which is, we keep using the standard strategy frameworks, and many of these were developed, decades ago. And sometimes the students say, well, isn't this kind of old thinking? So how does one respond to that when using, say, the 5 forces or, even the RBV, when, they're looking as well for newer ideas? And how does one kind of systematically incorporate newer ideas, not just new phenomena, but also newer theories, if you like, into the strategy course?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question and an ongoing challenge for all of us, right? So you asked about the five forces, of course, communication, yes, the five forces always matters. I mean it genuinely. What we found is we have to just keep adapting the old frameworks and adding in new ones that are relevant, right? Let me take each of those in turn. So, old frameworks, so the five forces, old way of teaching it to look at, use it to explain why an industry has been profitable forever, kind of the Cold War's case. We do some of that, but we passed by that very quickly. And we quickly moved to how do you use that framework to identify the relevant economic changes in an industry? How do you use it to reposition a company, to recognize the economic challenges with which a company has to deal, the differences from the past? We add in new considerations like complements in addition to substitutes. So we find ourselves constantly renewing the old frameworks, often recognizing that we have to do it in order to get them relevant for a new, and in our case, more volatile world. The second thing I found is, I don't know if others have found this too, I found that the nature of a good strategy and the purpose of a good strategy change in a volatile world, but the need for a good strategy doesn't change, right? And particularly the way I think about it is, I often say that a good strategy has three characteristics. It's externally consistent. It deals with the challenges and opportunities of the outside world today. It's internally consistent. The parts hold together. And it's dynamically consistent. It makes you do today what's required to succeed tomorrow. In a static world, you can focus the theory and the frameworks and the cases on how do you find the right position and align everything perfectly for the static world in which you're operating. And a good strategy kind of looks like a fixed set of choices. In a more dynamic world, in a volatile world, you're obsessed about dynamic consistency, right? Not finding a good place to moor yourself, but how do you move over time? Mm-hmm. And we find ourselves looking for ways of thinking about different things. For instance, like the organizational structure and the traits and habits of the individual human beings seem to matter more when it's all about how quickly you can adapt to a changing environment. So I think the characteristics of a good strategy look quite different, but you still need it. Right. Okay. So it's it's a great question, Ax. I wish I had an answer as good as the question itself.
That was a terrific answer.
Just a quick point on that is for sort of newer developments and existing ideas that are core, because we have to teach the core ideas. This idea of networks, I think one of the things that Doveb did very well was we went in the field and found that the firm in a network, do they really think about indirect ties? And there were some very interesting findings. So I think how you connect theory to practice and update the ideas. The network idea is very powerful, but that's one thing to think about. What is the framework? But Jan, I loved what you said about, how to update with complements in addition to five forces.
But Harbir, I think you're exactly right. The network thing, when I look at the companies that are thriving in the midst of COVID, mm-hmm. is often they're very skilled in how they're managing their networks.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so that's a real art.
Okay, folks. So let's. I think we've had a terrific discussion. Thank you, Harbir and Jan. You've been, absolutely brilliant and so very insightful. And all these are questions that I've been asking myself for years and years and years, of course. And you have given us some real food for thought. So let's move to some audience Q&A. So Naga asks, and I think it's directed at you, how do you think about simulations versus cases for strategy teaching?
Yeah, so we actually do a mix, and I believe they are both really important. They serve different purposes in my own teaching. I find that the simulations I find extraordinarily engaging for the students and very powerful in making students understand things like the need for a strategy or the need for a way to look at your industry that's structured. But then I find the cases to be a more effective vehicle for delivering those frameworks. I find in the midst of a simulation, it's very hard to, go back to the theory and pull out the framework. But man, the simulations are powerful in making the students hungry for those ideas. And then when they can apply them and see it makes a difference in the simulations, the light bulb just goes on.
Okay. A question from Asta with CNA. I apologize if I haven't pronounced it right. Case studies are the heart and soul of strategy teaching, but are there other complementarities that may be equally important?
Harbir, you want to take that? I'm happy to.
Let me just make one quick point there. And this may not be directly linking to your question, but I think that a multi-method approach to teaching really helps in my case. And I find cases are at times a wonderful way to illustrate a particular dynamic in an article, which is perhaps different from how the case writer may have intended. And that may be a complementary example where you're using a framework and using the case to just sort of introduce the key elements of the framework and spending a lot more time on the article, because the field has evolved a lot. There's a lot of literature. And the only other point is the guest speaker as a live case. We should think about guest speakers not just talking about it, because students need to understand, and the guest speaker needs to understand how their experience might be seen as a case. So those are the two things that would.
Yeah, no, and you've got the complementarities that I care about match yours, Harbir. So one is the simulations are a great complement to case studies, as we just talked about. Research, the ideas are the necessary complement. We don't have something to teach through the case studies. The case is a kind of empty vehicle. And the third for me, which relates to the guests, I always try to complement with personal reflection. The first question, a question I ask on the first day of every course is, what are the traits and habits of great strategists, and how can you develop them yourself? I urge the students every day, when they see a protagonist, when they think about their own behavior, when they think about their colleagues, what is it about that trait, that habit? And then the very last thing we speak about on the last day is, what were the patterns you noticed? And how's that's going to change your personal behavior to become a great strategist over time. So those are my three big compliments.
Very interesting.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. Okay, back to the notion of remote teaching. A question from Sumita Sharma: what is your take on online asynchronous classes, where the instructor does not meet the students in real time?
Asynchronous. So I have to say, my experience with asynchronous is everything I've done is synchronous, so I'm probably not the right person to field that one. I don't know, Harbir, do you have some insight on this?
I've also done only synchronous, but I'm co-teaching a class with someone from arts and sciences who's using asynchronous, and I learned a couple of interesting things, which is to use the asynchronous really to set up a synchronous discussion, which could be like a recitation, and the asynchronous becomes a well-packaged lecture and commentary or discussion around the themes of the class. So you're kind of distilling the didactic presentation from the interactive, and that was extraordinarily effective, I thought.
Yeah, I've done that, and so have my colleagues, and it really it concentrates the time you've got before Zoom fatigue sets in.
Yes, and the only issue there, again, to speak of challenges, is you're not confident that everyone has seen it in entirety, and you don't know with what level of focus they've seen it. In synchronous, we ask people to keep their cameras on, so you know that at least they're looking at the camera, maybe looking down at their phones at times, but there's a bit better connection.
Right. So let me jump in with my own experience. I've been doing the slide presentation part of the session asynchronously.
Yeah.
So I recorded those sessions, the asynchronous slide presentation, and then been using the synchronous part for case discussions only.
Yeah. And Ax, any hints on the dilemma that Harbir raises, that you don't know if folks have really engaged in that?
Well, what I do is I typically highlight a couple of key ideas from the asynchronous part in the synchronous part as well.
I see.
And I was actually teaching a blended course where I had some students on Zoom and some in person, face to face. And so I'd say, well, is there anything that you wanted me to emphasize, explain that you didn't pick up fully in that video? Because now's the time to talk about it.
There is wild innovation going on in our field, and I don't know that we've got a vehicle to capture the nuggets and spread them around.
Yeah. I think I was struck by how effective. So I remember you mentioned you do the presentation separately. The only additional point is, at least on our platform, you can actually see how much of the video they have seen in terms of minutes. But I chose not to. I mean, it was the other instructor. I chose not to look at that because it's kind of, I'm not sure you can use the information. But it gives you maybe an indication.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they could be looking at in front of the video, but they could still be working on their phone or
Yes, of course.
Oh,
right.
Yeah. Okay, so back to the questions, and I think this one is directed at you, Harbir, and it's from Dovev. And Dovev says, how can we increase our impact on management practice? Mm-hmm. Which is really, the big elephant in the room. And how do we remove the disconnects between our research and executives' daily practice, and how can we make a greater impact on practice?
Mm-hmm. So Dovev, nice to hear from you. And in fact, in your work, you on networks, you went out in the field and looked at Unisys and their network of relationships, and even when you abstract away what happens in taking all of Unisys as a node in a network. So and you went back and reported back on your results. So we've seen that cycle, and it was very fulfilling for me to be part in overseeing that. I think in general, it might be nice if SMS. So I think Don Hambrecht gave a great speech on strategists not being invited for congressional hearings on monopoly as much as economists and so on. And it might be good since we are on an SMS platform, it might be good for us to consider some puzzles. For example, sustainability of abnormal returns within industries, to really sort of bring in people who have been in companies that sustain higher returns and try to understand better, connect that with scholars, because a lot of our issues of sustainability are inferential based on theory and empirics. And I don't think that may result in new questions, for one thing. But I'm struck by, in life sciences, at least the epidemiology work now, how important the importance of phenomena are given. So if we can have that in our panels along with presenters, thoughtful practitioners, it may be a way to signal how impact can take place.
Yeah. Can I jump in on this one too, Max? So, I'm completely on board with what Harbir is saying. And part of the underlying thought is we have to start by making sure our research actually is relevant to practitioners, right? But there's also something really puzzling going on in the consumption patterns of the practice of managers. That I think I can't claim to have the answer here, but I think I've at least got part of the question. When I ask managers, how do you actually get your ideas and where are you getting information from these days? It is very rare that they're going to pick up, they're not going to pick our journals. They're even picking up things like Harvard Business Review or Soil Management Review less often. Mm-hmm. They're consuming it through podcasts. They're getting in very small tidbits at a time. They're going to a handful of conferences and learning from one another. Right. And we've got to find some way to have a voice in those media, or we'll just be speaking to ourselves. That's what I fear.
Absolutely. I completely agree.
Yeah, so a similar question along those lines, Jan. Pankaj Kumar asks, what is the future of teaching? He's my co-author and ex-student, by the way. What is the future of teaching in the next 10 years? Would it be dominated by firms like LinkedIn Learning? And what is the role the universities will continue to play? Because clearly universities are being threatened with disruption. So this is actually another big elephant in the room.
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, I wish I had an equally great answer. I think the one thing we can be pretty certain of is our established models are not going to be the ones that will make the university successful going forward. I've found in COVID, one of the things that's really struck me is my sense of our potential reach has increased. We find even in executive education, we've got active engagement and people coming for programs, and they're actually not the people who have come for the in-person programs. So I think we actually have a way to reach more people, but we don't necessarily have the channels that things like LinkedIn Learning does. So I've actually been trying to play with the notion of, is there some kind of partnership model? And this goes maybe to some of Harbir's work. Is there a way in which we can be the intel inside in some of the other mechanisms we will increasingly see reaching the executives and potentially the MBA students? I think the MBA probably a little more secure. Harbir, how do you think about this one? It's a great question.
Yes, it's an excellent question, and I think what you're saying is parallel to my experience. The thing I would add is, it's still early to see the difference between online and face-to-face in the executive education world.
Yeah.
But one of the things that it struck me was our work needs to be more globally robust. Because now when it comes to online, you get people, and often a bigger audience from overseas. And so that's something to think about, the appeal of our ideas and how we take seriously different environments. And the other one is on partnering. There are some organizations that are starting to do very well. One of them is a company in India called Eruditus, which represents INSEAD and Wharton and Harvard in India. But they also source faculty for a lot of programs, and they have very good client connections. So you're starting to see that segment will always be different. But as you said, the Intel Inside idea in terms of propagating ideas, but then it also has to be robust to their environment.
Yeah, I think imagining what the new value chain might look like and asking where do we uniquely add value, and then doubling down and do that well.
That's right.
I think it's at least what our own work would probably suggest we need to do for ourselves.
And it may suggest that the people who hold our degrees, maybe there's some feedback from that experience into what we put into our degree programs, because they become increasingly more, in the case of strategy, disciplinary and, in my view, context-free sometimes, and context really matters.
Yeah. And Harbir, do you think the distinction between the degree programs and the ongoing the exec ed type programs, do you think that distinction will hold up? Or do you think we get to a place where we've got kind of lifetime learning?
I was thinking more strategically in terms of selectivity as part of strategy. So as a business school, you want to make sure that your basis of reputation and differentiation is as robust as ever. But you're right. I think that the rest of the market has increased, and to not participate reduces your impact for one thing. But effective participation is what I was thinking about.
Cool.
Okay, so let's wrap up the Q&A, and what I'd like to do is ask, pick one question for Jan and one for Harbir, and then we'll wrap up the session. So Jan, a question for you from Sana C. What are strategies to gain access to management, especially executives, for writing cases?
There is an art to it for sure. I also realized that I come from a privileged position here because the Harvard brand name for case writing kind of opens some doors that are, I think a lot of people want their cases to be widely distributed, and the publishing arm allows that. So it's a little easier with that. What I've found is that if I go to a management team and I've got, and I genuinely want to understand what's going on, that they will typically open the doors pretty readily. But I definitely try to ease the door open. I don't go in and saying, I want to write a whole case and it's going to be a whole bunch of time and so forth. I go in initially and saying, can we explore things like what Harbir was mentioning, the executive visit, the live case. So can you just come to class? And we'll do it from a handful of slides and have a conversation. And then if that goes well from both sides and there's learning, then can we write up the case fully and so forth? So I've found that there's a relationship development aspect to it that really matters. There are also, the other thing I just highlight, I found that there's some individuals who come and want to be in cases and kind of immortalize themselves in cases, and you have to be very wary of that. Finding individuals who are truly motivated by the educational objective of the case study is precious. So I've occasionally had people come and say, rather than, I've done something great, can't you write a case? They've come and said, I've really messed up and I don't want anyone else to ever make this mistake again. And those are just lovely. So there's a fair amount of screening as well. There's a lot more to this, so I'd be happy to continue the conversation offline.
And Harbir, last question for you from Robert Wright in Hong Kong. What is one thing senior executives are not doing that they should be doing to better nurture the next generation of thought leaders for a complicated world?
Oh, what a great question. I think that's a fabulous question. I think, what's interesting is the movement towards purpose today, which has really taken hold. Thinking about purpose and not only shareholder value is something that I think needs attention because the legitimacy of the corporation is being challenged. And so some of this may be window dressing, but what are ways in which you can pursue purpose without compromising your returns, or at least enhancing the pie is one element. The other element, I just want to make a quick point that I've become very intrigued by strategic leadership. And I think when we teach strategy, we teach it analytically, and people who teach leadership teach it behaviorally. But looking at protagonists in the world of strategic practice, I would say in our teaching and research, if we can put the individual back into strategy, I think that will be really, really powerful.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so we'll have to wrap it up at this point, and I'm going to ask Jan for a minute or so of closing remarks. So, what would you like this terrific audience and the SMS world to take away? You've got so many ideas and so many insights that obviously impossible to encapsulate all that in 1 minute. But
yes, my 1 minute version. First of all, I just had words of gratitude to Ax and to Harbir and SMS and everyone on the call today. But I'd say, and I guess just my reflection would be this: look, it is a terrible and terribly challenging time in the world. We've got a pandemic, an economic collapse, a moral crisis around a long overdue racial reckoning. We've got climate crises. We've got a leadership crisis in politics. That said, I actually think it's a terrific time to be teaching and studying strategy. It is a great time to be a strategy prof. This is a time when the purpose and directions of organizations matter profoundly. It matters how leaders set the long-term directions of their organizations. The notion of purpose that Harbir just raised has profound implications. It matters how organizations balance their long-term direction versus the short-term pressure. And, I think it matters the specialty of being a generalist, which is fundamentally what the strategy field teaches. It is a time when, in a period of increasing specialization, the generalist really matters. So I think we should just all be profoundly grateful that we're here at a moment where what we do is really important. And I just want to wish everyone the best of health and happiness as they pursue it.
Okay, thanks, Jan. Nicely put. Harbir?
Thanks, Jan, for those inspiring words, particularly the things you said at the end. I would say that as a researcher, in thinking about practice and theory and putting them together, the first thing is to ask yourself, what animates you? What's your passion? When I finished my thesis, one of my committee members said, you'll be living with your thesis for many years. And I realized that that was such a profound point. So we have the privilege of choosing what we work on. So choose something that really keeps you going and has the energy that you can put behind it. The second thing is be aware of your journey. And there are use your journey in terms of reading articles or looking at phenomena in addition, and have it feed into your theory and your empirics. And the third one is for publishing strategy. We think about phenomena, theory, and empirics. You have to specialize. You have to play to your strengths. So be world class or aspire to be world class in one of those three, but take the other two seriously. And I'll join Jan in saying we're living in complicated times, but it's also an opportunity for new ideas. Best of health to everyone.
Okay. So, so with that, let me give you a little bit of a sense of what I took away from the things that both of our distinguished awardees talked about. And I certainly learned a huge amount from them, as I'm sure you did as well. And I'm talking about the panelists, the participants here. But I thought it was really interesting to see how both Jan and Harbir started with the phenomenon. So they were parallels in their respective journeys and in the way that they see the world and in the ways that they make their very unique and obviously outstanding contributions. They both started with the phenomenon. But beyond that, they diverged, or the next stage was a little bit of a divergence because Jan used the phenomena to write cases and to develop insights through those cases and to teach those cases and develop further insights. And then, as he has done so brilliantly with his colleague Giovanni Gavetti, to write theory papers on what that really represents and the distillation of that from a theoretical point of view, and published it in some of our best journals. Harbir, on the other hand, started with the phenomenon, as he mentioned, but then took a different perspective and a different lens, which is, how can I turn this into a researchable question, this interesting phenomenon that I'm seeing? And what kind of data will I need to be able to investigate this interesting research question? And then, of course, he analyzed that with his colleagues and his co-authors and turned that as well into a theory piece or an empirical piece in our top journals. So they, if you like, very interestingly, started at the same point and ended at the same point, but took different paths to get to that point. So I think we've reached the end of our time. And first of all, let me thank Jan and Harbir for their awards for this incredible, incredibly well-deserved recognition. Both of you are past masters at this game and are inspirations to really all of us and most certainly me. Thank you, webinar participants, for being here, asking questions. And thank you, SMS. Thank you, Andrea and Robin, for conducting this so smoothly and so incredibly well. Be well, take care, goodbye.